The piracy of the 1600s Caribbean was linked to the slave trade and the sugar trade. Both had histories stretching back millennia. Slaves. Throughout time and space, slavery has been a way for human in-groups to exploit human out-groups. In Europe, Christianity was long the distinguishing factor. To be sure, Christian masters had long owned Christian slaves. Yet the medieval reform campaign by which monks sought to purify the Catholic Church and restore an effective papacy for the institution in the beginning of its second millennium of existence, had also sought to establish the peace of God. Accordingly, a taboo arose over Christian slave masters possessing other Christians as slaves over the centuries. At first, Christian workers were both held in bondage and granted certain liberties through serfdom. Further reforms then ended serfdom in many kingdoms. If an employer then wished to keep workers in bondage, he needed to use debt. The preference of kings for issuing large units of currency over small units encouraged this. Rather than obtain scarce small units of currency, an employer could give workers goods equivalent to such sums of money in advance and then have the workers work to pay off the value of the advance. Until they did so, their employers, openly referred to as masters, could treat them as slaves, as with the reference of Shakespeare in his plays to whipping servants. Still, even such highly subjugated free laborers were insufficient for aspiring businessmen. The answer to their demand was uncovered by Portugal and Spain. Since these two kingdoms faced rival Muslim kingdoms, they were permitted to enslave POWs. Often, though, POWs were ransomed. In one instance, Muslims ransomed captives by paying Christians with black slaves. The Christians were inspired to go to the source of black slaves, Africa. And since these new laborers did not fit into their new societies, legal scholars ruled that after baptism, they and their descendants could be kept in bondage until their conduct matched their proclamation of faith. No criteria and end date were set. At most, it was speculated that the black slaves might be worthy of freedom in 1,000 years. In the meantime, employers had the slaves they wanted. The Christian powers first holding black slaves were in the Mediterranean. Portugal, with its outposts in the coast of Africa and Africa's offshore islands, was ground zero. At its peak, the Portuguese black slave trade left Portugal with 10% of its population as black slaves. From Portugal, black slaves went to Spain and then even further in the Mediterranean. Even so, black slaves always amounted to less than 1% of the population of Italy. At this point, it should be noted that Portugal's black slave population peaked long before the abolition of slavery. The aspiration of the conquerors of the New World to be aristocrats meant that the decline of Indians led to an insatiable demand for black slave labor. Millions would be sent to the Americas. The powers of Northern Europe at first applied their own debt-based labor system for the colonization of the Americas. Yet Portuguese influence and historical circumstance would lead to the adoption of racialized slavery. The kings seated in Madrid, Spain, had inherited both Portugal and what is now the Netherlands. Thus, when the Dutch sought an independent nation, they fought the king they sought to free themselves from by chartering a corporation to wage war. Once war brought Portuguese colonies under corporate control, the government authorized corporate administrators to establish justice and extract revenue. Brazil was thus taken. The new governing corporation of Brazil took over some plantations and retailed the products of plantations in the hands of others. Of these other plantations, some were owned by Dutch corporate personnel as well as their own private operations. Some plantations were owned by Portuguese loyal to the Catholic faith, denied by their heretical Dutch overlords. Still other plantations were owned by Portuguese planters who revealed their Judaism that the Inquisition had forced them to conceal beforehand. When a Portuguese independence movement expelled the forces of their previous Spain-based king and retook their colonies from the Dutch, the expelled planters, both Dutch and Portuguese Jewish, circulated through the Caribbean, introducing the idea of racialized slavery. Yet it would take a failed revolution in the colony of Virginia further to the north to commit planters to go that way from an already established debt-based labor system. The debt-based labor system of Northern Europe was of course modified for deployment to the Americas. Indentures, contracts setting predetermined terms of payment and service, replaced informal arrangements. Harsh working conditions often killed off indentured servants before the end of servitude set by the indentures. Planters were especially prone to find contract violations that extended terms of service. Still, many servants fulfilled their indentures and were entitled to land as a result. Even then, however, planters were prone to lay claim to nearby Indian lands that were then used to pay their indentured servants. Black slaves were added to the mix quickly, but colonial authorities were at first not prone to confirm their enslavement. Instead, colonial authorities only contributed to the profits of their abductors by requiring them to work through the indentures that paid off their buyers for the price of their arrival. Still, the first blacks born in Virginia were born free. Thus, the black and white workers of Virginia shared a common plight. For their part, the colonial authorities were faced with a question. Should they secure the vulnerable colony by making treaties with the Indian tribes, keeping the land they seized in return for accepting the Indian tribal lands in place? Or should neighboring Indian tribes be dispossessed like the Indians dispossessed in the original founding of the colony? The government of the colony of Virginia settled on peace treaties to provide security, but this left many workers, black and white, without the pay they had been promised. It was hinted that the cautious approach of the governor was due not to genuine concern for the colony and its people. Rather, the governor's peacemaking was alleged to be motivated by fur trade profits he personally acquired through deals with the tribes. Thus, scandal was the basis of Bacon's rebellion, and the British Army had to mobilize troops to restore the authority of the governor. In the aftermath of Bacon's rebellion, planters from Maryland to Guyana would introduce racialized slavery into colonial law. Even as far away as Quebec, white masters possessed black slaves. It is true that further waves of white indentured servants were sent to the Americas. Yet this form of labor massively declined in significance. Workers grew wary of indentured servitude in colonial plantations, which became notorious for their expression. Black market labor recruiters, whose abductions of children made the word kidnapping part of the English language, were suppressed. English suppressions of rebellions in Ireland added to white indentured servant manpower, but these occurred irregularly, hindering a regular supply. Eventually, white indentured servants tended to be criminals sentenced to such status by courts. As a result, even colonial elites were wary of them, and their continued arrivals ended in the aftermath of the American Revolution. As the heyday of the white indentured servant came to an end, the heyday of racialized slavery arose. Planter elites would privilege poor whites so that poor white militiamen would suppress black slave rebellions, guaranteeing that planter elites need not give black slaves any privileges and pay at all. That was how they reacted to Bacon's rebellion.